The sound of the slap did not disappear immediately. It stayed, hung in the air like a crack through glass, sharp enough to silence an entire hall filled with wolves. Even the music died awkwardly, the final violin note dragging across the room before collapsing into quiet. No one moved. Not the council elders seated beneath the silver banners of Moonfang. Not the warriors stationed beside the marble pillars. Not the servants frozen mid-step with trays balanced in trembling hands. An entire pack watched their Luna bleed. And nobody spoke. Because in packs like Moonfang, power mattered more than truth. And Alpha Kale had power enough to make people ignore almost anything. Even this. Especially this. Aurelia stood perfectly still beneath the chandeliers. Her face turned slightly from the force of the strike. One hand remained at her side. The other slowly touched the corner of her mouth where blood gathered carefully against her skin. The movement was calm. Too calm. And that was the first thing several people would later remember with unease. Not the slap. Not Kale's anger. But how quiet Aurelia became afterward. As though something inside her had finally gone still. At the center of the hall, Alpha Kale looked magnificent in the cruel way powerful men often did. Tall. Broad-shouldered. Golden-eyed. The kind of alpha warriors obeyed instinctively. The kind of man entire territories feared disappointing. And standing beside him in silver silk was Celine Voss. Beautiful Celine. Polished Celine. The Eastern Alpha's daughter with her perfect posture and watchful eyes. The woman the pack had spent months comparing to Aurelia in whispers disguised as compliments. She carries herself like a true Luna. She understands politics better. She looks stronger beside him. Quiet little comments. Tiny cuts. Never loud enough to confront. Only deep enough to wound. Kale's jaw remained tense as he stared at Aurelia. Learn your place. The words landed harder than the strike. Because they confirmed what many in the hall had already suspected for months. The Luna had fallen out of favor. And in Moonfang Territory, being unloved by the Alpha was more dangerous than being hated. Near the eastern tables an elder lowered his eyes. A servant girl bit the inside of her cheek hard enough to bleed. One of the younger warriors looked disturbed enough to step forward. Until his commander grabbed his arm sharply. No one interfered. No one ever interfered when Alphas lost control. The silence stretched. Long enough for humiliation to fully settle into the room. Long enough for Aurelia to realize nobody was coming to her defense. And then, Celine smiled. Small. Brief. Barely visible. But Aurelia saw it. So did someone else. At the far edge of the hall, partially hidden beneath shadow and black stone columns, Alpha Ronan Blackwood watched everything unfold without blinking. Unlike the others, he did not look uncomfortable. He looked furious. Not openly. Not recklessly. Ronan Blackwood was not a man ruled by visible emotion. His anger was quieter than that. Controlled. Heavy. The kind that made seasoned warriors reconsider their next breath. Several guests noticed him gripping the armrest of his chair hard enough for the wood beneath his fingers to splinter slowly. But no one commented on it. No one wanted his attention. Especially not tonight. The rivalry between Kale and Ronan had lasted nearly a decade. Territory disputes. Border clashes. Political sabotage. 3 near-war incidents. And underneath all of it sat something older. Personal hatred. Not the kind formed overnight. The kind built carefully over years. The kind men carry into graves. Which made what happened next far more dangerous than anyone in that hall understood. Because Aurelia lifted her head. And instead of looking at Kale, she looked at Ronan. The shift was subtle, yet immediate. Ronan straightened slightly in his seat. Kale noticed. So did Celine. And suddenly the entire atmosphere inside Moonfang Hall changed. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Like ice beginning to crack beneath people standing too confidently on frozen water. Aurelia wiped the blood from her lip with the back of her hand. Then she moved. 1 step. The sound of her heels echoed softly across polished stone. Another step. The crowd parted instinctively. Nobody told them to move. They simply did. Because something about the look in Aurelia's eyes unsettled them. Not rage. Not heartbreak. Something colder. The expression of someone who had finally reached the end of their pain. Behind her, Kale frowned. Aurelia. For years that voice had stopped entire rooms. Warriors obeyed it instantly. Betas lowered their heads to it. Enemies feared it. But Aurelia kept walking. The first visible crack appeared in Kael's composure then. Tiny. Almost impossible to notice. But it was there. Because disobedience from strangers was expected. Disobedience from his mate was unthinkable. The hall remained deathly silent as Aurelia crossed the distance toward Ronan Blackwood. He rose slowly to his feet before she even reached him. Towering. Dangerously calm. His dark eyes never left her face. And when she stopped in front of him, close enough for the entire room to see the bruise already forming against her cheek, something unreadable crossed his expression. Not pity. Ronan Blackwood did not pity people. It looked more like restraint. As though he were holding himself back from doing something irreversible. Aurelia reached for the silver crescent pinned against her dress. The symbol of Moonfang Luna. The mark that identified her as Kael's. Her fingers trembled only once before she removed it. The tiny metallic sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet hall. Several elders visibly stiffened. Because everyone understood what that gesture meant. Aurelia looked directly into Ronan's eyes. Then placed the Luna crest into his hand. The room erupted into horrified whispers instantly. Kale stepped forward. What the hell are you doing? For the first time that night, emotion entered his voice. Not anger. Something sharper. Something dangerously close to panic. Aurelia finally turned toward him. Tears burned behind her eyes but none fell. That frightened Kale more than if she had screamed. Because Aurelia always cried quietly. Always forgave quietly. Always suffered quietly. But this version of her felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar things are difficult to control. If you wanted a performance tonight, Alpha, she said softly. Her gaze flicked briefly toward Celine. Then let me give the pack one they'll never forget. No one breathed. Not when Ronan closed his hand around the Luna crest. Not when Kael's wolf surged violently through the bond. Not when Celine's expression shifted for the first time all evening. Because in that moment, everyone inside Moonfang Hall understood something terrible. The slap had not started the disaster. It had only revealed it. And none of them yet realized how far Aurelia was truly willing to walk away. Or how dangerous Ronan Blackwood would become once she did. Heartbreak inside powerful packs rarely arrives through screaming arguments. It arrives through absence. The absence of warmth. The absence of protection. The absence of being chosen. And in Moonfang Territory, people had started noticing the changes between their Alpha and Luna long before either of them admitted it aloud. At first, the shifts were subtle enough to ignore. Kale stopped waiting for Aurelia after council meetings. Stopped reaching for her hand automatically. Stopped looking for her first whenever he entered crowded rooms. Small things. Easy things to dismiss individually. But pain has a way of collecting quietly over time. Especially for mates. Especially for wolves tied together by instinct stronger than logic. The Moonfang servants noticed first. Servants always notice first. They saw Aurelia dining alone more often. Saw untouched meals return to the kitchens late at night. Saw Kael's chambers remain lit until dawn while Aurelia slept in another wing under the excuse of healing duties. No one dared speak about it openly. Not because they lacked opinions. Because discussing instability inside an alpha bond was dangerous. And Kael's temper had become increasingly difficult to predict over the past year. The stronger Moonfang grew politically, the harsher Kale became personally. Victories hardened him. Power sharpened him. The wars along the western border made him feared. The alliance negotiations made him respected. But somewhere during that rise, the version of Kale that once carried Aurelia through winter storms began disappearing. Some believed responsibility changed him. Others believed this was simply who he had always been beneath affection. Even Aurelia no longer knew which answer frightened her more. By the second year of their mating, the atmosphere inside the Alpha residence had already shifted noticeably. The halls became quieter. The distance between their rooms grew larger despite existing beneath the same roof. Pack gatherings became performances rather than companionship. Kale still touched her publicly when necessary. Still called her my Luna in front of outsiders. Still maintained appearances. But wolves can sense emotional withdrawal the way humans sense weather changing before rain. And Aurelia felt it constantly. In the coldness of his voice. In delayed responses. In the way his attention drifted elsewhere while she spoke. Then Celine Voss arrived. And everything accelerated. The Eastern delegation entered Moonfang Territory during the first heavy snowfall of winter. 15 guards. 3 council advisors. 2 servants. And Celine, the daughter of Eastern Alpha Magnus Voss. She entered Moonfang Hall dressed in silver fur and confidence sharp enough to command attention without effort. People remembered the exact moment Kale first looked at her. Not because it was romantic. Because it was immediate. The recognition between ambitious people often is. Celine carried herself like someone raised around power her entire life. Controlled smile. Measured words. Eyes that missed nothing. Where Aurelia soothed rooms, Celine conquered them. And Kale noticed instantly. At first, Aurelia blamed herself for the discomfort clawing through her chest. Jealousy felt ugly. Immature. Beneath her. She convinced herself she was imagining things. But mate bonds are cruelly honest. Wolves feel emotional shifts before actions confirm them. That was the curse of being deeply connected to another person. You sense the leaving long before they walk away. The first warning came during the Midwinter Council feast. Kale forgot their bond anniversary, a date he had once celebrated obsessively. The same Alpha who used to leave handwritten notes beside her bedside now spent the entire evening discussing military trade routes with Celine while Aurelia sat unnoticed at the opposite end of the table. Several elders saw it. Several servants exchanged uncomfortable glances. But nobody intervened. Because acknowledging emotional neglect inside an alpha bond would mean acknowledging weakness inside the leadership itself. And powerful packs protect appearances before people. That night, Aurelia locked herself inside the bathing chambers after midnight. The servants later whispered about hearing muffled crying through the marble walls. Quiet crying. The kind people do when they don't want to inconvenience anyone with their pain. The next shift came weeks later. Small. Devastating. Kale pulled away from her touch. It lasted less than 2 seconds. A subtle movement most people would never notice. But Aurelia noticed immediately. Because mates memorize each other instinctively. She remembered the exact tension in his shoulders. The exact hesitation. The exact look of irritation crossing his face before he masked it. Her wolf withdrew afterward. Silent for nearly 2 full days. That silence terrified her more than anger ever could. Because wolves go quiet when bonds begin weakening emotionally. And somewhere deep down, Aurelia already knew what was happening. She simply wasn't ready to survive it yet. Then came the code incident. The moment several members of Moonfang privately realized the rumors might be true. It happened during an early morning patrol inspection near the eastern gates. Snow covered nearly everything. Warriors lined the walls. Servants hurried through frozen courtyards carrying supplies. And descending the northern staircase wearing Kale's black ceremonial coat was Celine. The coat alone meant little politically. Alphas often offered protection from cold to honored guests. But it wasn't the gesture that unsettled people. It was the familiarity. Celine wore it comfortably, confidently, as though she had worn it before. Aurelia saw her from across the courtyard. And although her expression barely changed, several nearby servants later admitted the air around the Luna suddenly felt painfully cold. Celine smiled politely upon noticing her. Alpha Kale insisted, she explained lightly. Aurelia nodded once. Nothing more. No accusation. No scene. No jealousy displayed publicly. That restraint somehow made the moment worse. Because pain handled quietly often carries the most damage. From that point onward, the pack began splitting silently into sides. Not openly. Never openly. But through whispers. Comparisons. Speculation. Some believed Celine matched Kale better politically. Others remained loyal to Aurelia out of affection and guilt. But the dangerous part was this. Kale never stopped the rumors. Not once. And that silence gave people permission to continue. The Luna slowly became isolated inside her own territory. Conversations ended when she entered rooms. Council members avoided difficult eye contact. Warriors who once greeted her warmly became formal and cautious. As if everyone were waiting for something inevitable to happen. Even Aurelia started feeling like a guest inside her own home. Still, she stayed. Because love makes people endure unbearable things long after they should leave. Especially women who mistake patience for loyalty. And then came the banquet. The strike. The humiliation. The moment private cruelty became public. Later, several witnesses would describe the atmosphere inside Moonfang Hall differently. Some called it shocking. Others called it tragic. One elder reportedly said the moment Kale struck Aurelia, the entire future of Moonfang shifted. But the detail repeated most often afterward was not the slap itself. It was what happened after. Because for one terrible moment after Kale's hand connected with her face, nobody moved. Not a single person defended the Luna. Not the council. Not the guards. Not even the beta standing closest to the throne. Fear held the room hostage. Fear of Kale. Fear of choosing sides. Fear of becoming involved in something clearly breaking apart. And Aurelia saw all of it. Every lowered gaze. Every silence. Every person who decided her humiliation was safer to tolerate than confront. That was the true betrayal. Not Kale's violence. The pack's acceptance of it. But then, a chair scraped sharply against stone at the far end of the hall. The sound cut through the silence instantly. Heads turned. And for the first time that evening, people looked afraid for an entirely different reason. Because Alpha Ronan Blackwood had just stood up. The moment Ronan Blackwood stood, the atmosphere inside Moonfang Hall shifted into something dangerous. Not chaotic. Worse. Controlled. The kind of control that exists seconds before violence. Several warriors instinctively moved closer to their weapons. Council members exchanged uneasy looks across the long silver tables. Even the musicians near the southern balcony slowly lowered their instruments, sensing what everyone else sensed. This was no longer a domestic dispute between mates. This was becoming political. And political conflicts between alphas had buried entire packs before. Ronan Blackwood remained near the shadowed edge of the hall, one gloved hand still wrapped around the silver Luna crest Aurelia had placed into his palm moments earlier. The tiny object looked strangely fragile against him. Because nothing about Ronan appeared gentle. Stories about the Blackwood Alpha had traveled across territories for years, growing darker with every retelling. Some called him ruthless. Others called him necessary. The distinction often depended on which side of him people had encountered. He ruled the Blackwood Territory through fear, discipline, and brutal efficiency. Rogues disappeared near his borders. Traitors rarely survived public punishment. And unlike many alphas, Ronan never apologized for the violence required to maintain control. That honesty unsettled people more than cruelty itself. Most leaders hid what they were. Ronan never bothered. Yet despite his reputation, there were rumors that contradicted the monster people described. Rumors of him rebuilding villages destroyed during winter raids. Rumors of servants receiving protection under Blackwood law stronger than warriors received elsewhere. Rumors that he once executed one of his own commanders for assaulting a healer girl during wartime. No one knew which version of Ronan Blackwood was true. Perhaps both were. Men capable of terrible violence often are. Kale descended the throne platform slowly, every movement measured with dangerous restraint. His eyes remained locked on Aurelia. Not Ronan. Her. And several people in the hall noticed something unsettling in his expression for the first time that evening. Confusion. Because Kale understood conflict. He understood power struggles. He understood war. What he did not understand was Aurelia refusing him publicly? That was unfamiliar territory. And unfamiliar things make powerful men unpredictable. Aurelia, he repeated quietly. The softness in his tone disturbed the room more than shouting would have. Moonfang warriors knew that voice. Kale used it moments before violence. You will come here. Now. For years, Aurelia would have obeyed instantly. Not because she lacked strength. Because she loved him enough to choose peace over pride repeatedly. But heartbreak changes the meaning of obedience. And standing beside Ronan Blackwood, with the entire pack watching her humiliation unfold, Aurelia realized something she should have understood months ago. Love without protection eventually becomes surrender. She did not move. That single act of stillness triggered more tension than any scream could have. Several elders visibly stiffened. One servant quietly backed toward the exit. Near the eastern tables, Celine Voss watched carefully, her composed expression beginning to fracture around the edges. Because this situation had already moved beyond her control, perhaps beyond anyone's. Then Ronan finally spoke. "She's not moving." His voice carried across the hall with terrifying calm. No raised volume. No dramatic threat. Just certainty. And somehow that certainty unnerved people more than anger. Kale's jaw tightened immediately. "This is between me and my mate." Ronan's eyes flicked briefly toward the bruise darkening Aurelia's cheek. When he looked back at Kale, something cold settled into his expression. "No," he said. "You made it everyone's business the second you touched her." The silence afterward felt suffocating. Because nobody inside Moonfang Hall had dared say the obvious aloud until now. Not the elders. Not the beta. Not the warriors. Only Ronan. And Kale hated him for it instantly. Not because the accusation was false. Because it was true. A low murmur spread through the hall despite people trying to suppress it. Whispers moved quickly between guests. Some were shocked. Some uncomfortable. Some quietly relieved another alpha had finally acknowledged what the pack refused to confront. Kale's control slipped slightly then. Not enough for outsiders to notice. Enough for Aurelia to feel through the mate bond. Anger. Possessiveness. Something dangerously close to panic. Because Ronan Blackwood was interfering in territory Kale believed belonged solely to him. Not political territory. Personal territory. Celine stepped forward carefully, clearly attempting to stabilize the situation before it escalated further. "Perhaps emotions are simply high tonight." She never finished the sentence. Ronan looked at her. Just looked at her. But whatever existed inside those dark eyes silenced her instantly. Celine stopped speaking mid-breath. And for the first time since arriving in Moonfang Territory, uncertainty crossed her face openly. It lasted less than a second. Still long enough for people to notice. Ronan Blackwood rarely directed attention toward women publicly. Yet the little attention he gave now carried a warning sharp enough to freeze the room. Not because he hated Celine. Because he considered her irrelevant to the real issue standing before him. Aurelia. Kale noticed that too. And something inside him reacted violently. The pressure of his alpha wolf suddenly expanded across the hall. Heavy. Dominant. Threatening. Candles flickered from the force of it. Several weaker wolves lowered their heads instinctively. One young servant nearly collapsed beneath the intensity. Kale's power had always overwhelmed rooms during anger. But tonight it carried something uglier beneath it. Fear. Not fear of Ronan. Fear of losing control over Aurelia. That realization unsettled him deeply. Because up until this moment, Kale believed the situation remained manageable. Aurelia would cry. Retreat. Eventually forgive him like she always had. That was the pattern. That was the safety of routine. But she was no longer reacting the way she used to. And people noticed quickly when quiet women stopped pleading. Ronan remained completely unaffected by Kale's dominance. He stood still beside Aurelia like a black wall against a storm. No submission. No hesitation. Nothing. The rivalry between the two alphas had always been dangerous precisely because neither yielded naturally. Kale ruled through dominance. Ronan ruled through refusal. And now Aurelia stood directly between them. The symbolism alone threatened disaster. A council elder finally rose halfway from his seat, visibly nervous. "Perhaps," he began cautiously, "this discussion should continue privately." "No," Kale snapped immediately. The elder sat back down at once. Another silence followed. Long. Oppressive. And during that silence, Aurelia noticed something strange. Ronan had not touched her once. Not her arm. Not her waist. Not even reassuringly. He simply stood beside her. Giving her the choice Kale no longer realized he had been taken away long ago. That difference mattered more than anyone understood. Kale stepped closer down the final marble stair. "Aurelia," he said again, quieter now. And beneath the anger, there it was. Desperation beginning to surface. "You're embarrassing yourself." The words echoed sharply through the hall. Several people looked uncomfortable immediately. Because even now, Kale still didn't understand what was truly happening. He thought this was defiance. Pride. Temporary anger. He still believed Aurelia's humiliation reflected poorly on her instead of him. And the most dangerous part? Aurelia finally realized that too. The understanding settled slowly inside her chest like ice sinking beneath water. Kale wasn't cruel because he hated her. He was cruel because somewhere along the way he stopped seeing her pain as important. That realization severed something deep inside her. Not the mate bond. Something older. Trust. Ronan's gaze shifted toward her briefly then, studying her carefully, as though recognizing the exact second a person stops hoping, and for reasons nobody in that hall fully understood yet. That seemed to make him angrier than the slap itself. The banquet should have ended after the confrontation. Most people expected Aurelia to disappear quietly into the upper chambers like wounded Lunas in old stories often did. Cry privately. Recover privately. Return beside her alpha tomorrow pretending nothing had happened. That was how powerful packs survive scandals. Not through honesty. Through silence. But Moonfang Hall did not recover that night. It fractured. Slowly. Uneasily. The guests resumed speaking eventually, but the atmosphere never returned to normal. Music restarted half-heartedly near the southern balcony. Servants continued pouring wine with trembling hands. Council members forced themselves back into political conversations they clearly no longer cared about. Yet beneath every interaction lingered the same uncomfortable awareness. Everyone had witnessed something irreversible. And the worst part was not the slap itself. It was the reaction afterward. Because the pack had watched their Luna walk away emotionally in real time. Some recognized it immediately. Others would only understand later. But the damage had already begun. Aurelia remained inside the hall longer than she should have. Long enough to hear the whispers spreading behind lowered hands and careful expressions. She embarrassed the alpha. She pushed him too far. Celine would never behave this way publicly. Interesting how quickly humiliation becomes the victim's fault, once they stop enduring it quietly. No one called Kale unstable for striking her. No one questioned why an alpha needed public cruelty to maintain authority. Instead, the scrutiny shifted toward Aurelia the moment she resisted. That pattern existed in nearly every powerful territory. People tolerate suffering far more comfortably than disruption. And Aurelia finally understood something painful that night. The pack had never loved her enough to defend her. Only enough to pity her afterward. The realization settled heavily inside her chest as she moved through the western corridors alone. Moonfang Keep felt colder after midnight. The massive stone hallways carried every sound sharply. Footsteps echoed endlessly. Torchlight flickered against ancient walls lined with portraits of past alphas and Lunas who all appeared equally miserable beneath expensive oil paint. Aurelia walked without direction at first. Not because she was lost. Because she needed distance from the eyes downstairs. Distance from the whispers. Distance from Kale. But powerful men rarely allow emotional distance once control begins slipping. The moment she turned into the western corridor, Kale appeared behind her. Fast. Silent. Like a predator. The heavy doors slammed shut the second he entered. The sound echoed violently through the corridor. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Kale stood near the entrance breathing harder than he should have been. Not from exhaustion. Anger. Possessiveness. Something dangerously unstable simmered beneath his composure now. Without the crowd watching, the restraint he maintained downstairs had vanished almost entirely. What were you thinking? The question cracked through the corridor sharply. Aurelia turned slowly toward him, and for the first time in years, she felt tired instead of afraid. That difference mattered. Because fear keeps relationships alive long after love starts dying. But exhaustion ends them. You hit me, she said quietly. Kale's jaw tightened instantly. You provoked me. There it was. Not regret. Justification. And strangely enough, that hurt more than the slap itself. Not because Aurelia expected perfection from him. Because some hidden part of her still believed he would eventually look horrified by what he had done. Still believed the Kale she once loved remained somewhere underneath all this anger and pride. Instead, he defended himself immediately. As though her humiliation were merely an unfortunate consequence of her behavior. Kale dragged a frustrated hand through his dark hair and began pacing the corridor. You undermined me in front of the entire pack. Aurelia stared at him. Then suddenly, she laughed. Softly, barely above a whisper. But the sound stopped Kale immediately. Because Aurelia almost never laughed during arguments. She cried. She pleaded. She tried to fix things. This laughter felt unfamiliar. And unfamiliar reactions make people nervous. Especially controlling people. Kale looked at her carefully then, as though seeing something he did not recognize. Do you know what's sad? She asked quietly. Her voice remained painfully calm. You didn't even notice when you stopped loving me. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Kale's expression shifted briefly. Tiny. Almost invisible. But Aurelia saw it. So did his wolf through the bond. Because deep down some part of him knew exactly what she meant. The distance. The neglect. The emotional withdrawal stretching across months. Perhaps even years. But acknowledging it would require confronting something Kale avoided at all costs. The possibility that he had become cruel gradually rather than accidentally. And that terrified him. His face hardened again almost immediately. This is politics, Aurelia. You don't understand what's at stake. The explanation came too quickly. Too rehearsed. As though he had already justified everything to himself long before tonight happened. Aurelia studied him quietly beneath the torchlight. Then nodded once. No, she whispered. I understand perfectly. That answer unsettled him more than outrage would have. Because she truly did understand. Celine strengthened alliances. Celine impressed council members. Celine fit the image of the politically ambitious Luna Kale increasingly desired beside him. And Aurelia? A healer. Gentle. Quiet. Emotional. Useful for comfort perhaps. Not power. Not strategy. Not advancement. Kale's silence confirmed everything he refused to say aloud. The truth stood between them, ugly and unavoidable. Celine mattered politically. Aurelia no longer did. For several long seconds, only the crackling torches filled the corridor. Then Kale stepped closer. You're my mate. The words should have comforted her once. Instead, the mate bond twisted painfully inside her chest like something wounded. Because bonds mean very little when respect disappears. Aurelia finally realized the horrifying difference between being claimed and being cherished. Kale still viewed her as his. But ownership is not love. And possession is not protection. That realization changed something fundamental inside her. Slowly, Aurelia lifted her eyes toward him. I was your mate, she corrected softly. The correction barely registered at first. Then Kale froze. Not visibly. Internally. Because wolves take mate language seriously. Very seriously. And Aurelia had just spoken about their bond in past tense. The corridor became deathly quiet. Kale stared at her as though waiting for the familiar softness to return. Waiting for tears. Waiting for surrender. Waiting for the version of Aurelia who always reached for reconciliation first. But she simply looked tired. And somehow that frightened him more than hatred would have. Aurelia turned toward the corridor exit slowly. Kale did not stop her. That detail would haunt him later. Not because he physically allowed her to leave. Because emotionally, he believed she would return regardless. That was the tragedy of men accustomed to unconditional forgiveness. They mistake endurance for permanence. As Aurelia walked away, Kale remained motionless in the corridor, listening to her footsteps fade farther and farther into the distance. One of the guards stationed outside later admitted something strange about that moment. Kale did not look angry anymore. He looked uncertain, as though only now realizing he may have crossed a line he did not fully understand. But by then, the damage had already moved beyond repair. Because relationships rarely collapse during the loud moments. They collapse quietly. In corridors. In silences. In the exact second one person walks away believing the other will never truly chase after them. And that night inside Moonfang Keep, Aurelia stopped waiting to be chosen. By midnight, Moonfang Keep no longer felt like home. The storm rolling across the territory seemed to press against the castle itself, rain striking stone walls and black rooftops hard enough to sound almost violent. Most guests from the banquet had already retreated into private chambers. Council members drank quietly behind closed doors. Warriors rotated through late-night patrol shifts beneath torchlight and rain. And somewhere inside the eastern wing, Alpha Kale remained awake. Several servants would later claim they heard furniture breaking inside his chambers sometime after midnight. None investigated. No one in Moonfang Territory interrupted an angry alpha voluntarily. Especially not after what happened at the banquet. Meanwhile, Aurelia stood alone near the northern stables, wrapped tightly beneath a dark cloak already soaked through by cold rain. The northern side of the estate remained quieter than the rest of the keep, farther from the banquet halls, farther from the council chambers, farther from the whispers. Only stable lanterns flickered weakly through the storm, casting pale gold light against wet stone and restless horses shifting inside their stalls. Aurelia had not planned to come there. Her feet simply carried her somewhere nobody would look for her immediately. That detail mattered. Because wounded people rarely search for comfort first. They search for somewhere private enough to fall apart. And for the first time in years, Aurelia truly had nowhere left to go inside her own territory. Not emotionally. Not safely. The realization settled heavier than the rain itself. She was still Luna by title. Still marked by the Alpha. Still living inside Moonfang walls. Yet she had never felt more displaced. There are moments in collapsing relationships where people begin understanding the truth before admitting it aloud. This was one of them. Aurelia wrapped her arms tighter around herself as cold winds swept through the stable yard. Not because she was physically weak. Because exhaustion had finally reached her bones. The kind created by enduring too much for too long. And then, you should be inside. The voice came from behind her. Deep. Calm. Close enough to startle her despite the storm. Aurelia turned immediately. Ronan Blackwood stood beneath one of the hanging lanterns near the stable entrance, rain sliding slowly down the dark fabric of his coat. He looked almost unreal against the storm. Tall enough to block the lantern light partially. Dark hair damp from rain. Steel-colored eyes fixed directly on her with unnerving focus. Unlike Kale, Ronan rarely carried visible aggression in his posture. That was what made him intimidating. His control. Even standing perfectly still, he carried the feeling of restrained violence. The kind men learn after surviving too many battles. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Rain hammered the rooftops above them. Somewhere inside the stables, a horse shifted nervously. Aurelia finally broke the silence first. "I'm not in the mood for pity." The words came out quieter than intended. Not sharp. Just tired. Ronan's expression changed slightly. Not softer. Darker. "Good," he replied immediately. "I don't pity you." That answer hit harder than comfort would have. Because pity was exactly what everyone else had offered her all evening. The servants looked at her with pity. The elders spoke to her carefully because of pity. Even the women who privately supported her treated her like something damaged. But Ronan? Ronan looked at her like someone had committed an offense against her. A serious one. There was anger in him. Real anger. Not at her. For her. And Aurelia realized with sudden disorientation that nobody had looked at her that way in a very long time. "At least someone in that hall should have defended you," Ronan muttered. His voice remained calm. But the tension beneath it sharpened noticeably. Aurelia studied him carefully then. Trying to understand him. Trying to understand why the most feared alpha in the Northern Territories seemed more disturbed by her humiliation than her own mate. "Why do you care?" she asked finally. The question lingered between them. Ronan did not answer immediately. His gaze held hers steadily through the rain. Long enough to become dangerous. Because eye contact between wolves carries meaning. Challenge. Attention. Recognition. And something about the way Ronan looked at Aurelia felt far too intentional to dismiss casually. Finally he spoke. "Because I know what it looks like when someone destroys something precious after taking it for granted." The statement landed strangely. Not rehearsed. Not political. Personal. Aurelia noticed the subtle shift in his expression afterward. Brief. Controlled. But there. As though the words touched something old inside him. And suddenly she realized something unsettling. Ronan Blackwood understood this kind of pain far better than he should have. The rain intensified sharply then, pouring harder across the stable roofs. Cold wind swept through the yard again. Without another word, Ronan stepped closer. Not enough to invade her space. Enough to reach for the clasp of his heavy black coat. Aurelia frowned faintly. "What are you doing?" Ronan ignored the question completely. He removed the coat and draped it carefully around her shoulders. Warmth surrounded her instantly. The fabric smelled faintly like cedarwood, rain, steel, and wolf. Comfortingly masculine. Dangerously comforting. Aurelia froze. Not because of the gesture itself. Because her wolf reacted immediately. For weeks, perhaps months now, her wolf had felt quiet. Withdrawn. Weak beneath the strain inside the mate bond. But the moment Ronan's coat settled around her shoulders, something stirred awake inside her chest. Not attraction. Not yet. Something more primitive. Safety. And that realization frightened her deeply. Because wolves do not calm around people they consider unsafe. Ronan stepped back afterward as though the moment meant nothing. No lingering touch. No attempt to move closer. That restraint affected Aurelia more than flirtation would have. Kale had spent months making her feel emotionally invisible. Yet Ronan somehow made her feel seen without even touching her directly. The contrast became impossible to ignore. "You should leave Moonfang for a while," Ronan said quietly. Aurelia looked at him sharply. His expression remained unreadable. "That sounds dangerously close to treason. It sounds like survival." Another silence stretched between them. Long. Heavy. And beneath that silence, Aurelia felt something else building now. Not just grief. Awareness. Because for the first time since the banquet began, she noticed the larger danger unfolding around her. This was no longer simply about a failing marriage. It was becoming political. If Aurelia left Moonfang publicly, if she aligned herself with Ronan even temporarily, entire territories would react. Council alliances would fracture. Enemies would exploit weakness. Kale's authority would suffer. And perhaps worst of all, people would talk. The Luna standing beside her mate's greatest rival would become more than scandal. It would become provocation. Ronan seemed fully aware of that already. Yet he stood there anyway. Offering shelter anyway. Watching her carefully beneath the storm as though waiting to see whether she would finally choose herself over loyalty. Inside the keep, thunder rolled above the mountains. And several floors above them, unseen behind rain-streaked windows, Alpha Kale watched the northern stable yard in silence, watching Aurelia wrapped in another alpha's coat. The first rumors began spreading 3 days after the banquet. Quietly. Carefully. Like all dangerous rumors do. The Moonfang Luna had been seen crossing into Blackwood territory. The Blackwood Alpha had personally escorted her. She was staying temporarily in the northern guest estate near the river cliffs. No one knew whether the arrangement was political, personal, temporary, or something far more damaging. But every territory heard about it within a week. Because information travels unnaturally fast when powerful men are involved. Especially powerful men who hate each other. And perhaps most unsettling of all, Kale did not publicly deny any of it. That silence fueled speculation immediately. Inside Moonfang Keep, the atmosphere deteriorated rapidly. Council meetings grew tense. Warriors became divided. Servants whispered constantly in empty corridors. Some blamed Aurelia. Others blamed Kale privately while avoiding saying so aloud. But nearly everyone agreed on one thing. Ronan Blackwood's involvement made the situation far more dangerous than heartbreak alone. Because if Aurelia had fled to anyone else, Kale could have reclaimed control quietly. But Ronan? Ronan turned emotional conflict into political humiliation simply by existing. And Kale understood that better than anyone. Meanwhile, Blackwood territory remained exactly as unsettling as the stories claimed. The northern lands stretched darker than Moonfang forests. Colder. Harsher. The mountains surrounding the territory blocked sunlight early each evening, leaving long shadows across stone villages and dense pine forests. Even the warriors carried themselves differently there. Disciplined. Silent. Watchful. Nothing inside Blackwood lands felt careless, including Ronan himself. Aurelia noticed it immediately during her first week staying within the northern estate. Ronan paid attention to everything. Not obsessively. Instinctively. The first time he realized she disliked raised voices, he dismissed 2 arguing commanders from the dining hall before continuing conversation with her. He never mentioned the gesture afterward, which somehow made it matter more. The second time he noticed her hands trembling during a thunderstorm, Extra firewood appeared in her chambers without explanation. The third time he caught her skipping meals. An elderly servant quietly began bringing food directly to the healing room where she worked. Again, no comment from Ronan. No dramatic concern. Just solutions. Simple, steady, consistent. And slowly, Aurelia began understanding something deeply uncomfortable. Kale used to notice things like that once. Years ago. Before power consumed more of his attention than people did. Before ambition sharpened him into someone harder to reach emotionally. That comparison haunted her constantly. Because the issue was never that Kale lacked the ability to care. The issue was that somewhere along the way, he stopped trying. One evening near dusk, Aurelia worked beside several injured patrol wolves inside the Blackwood infirmary after a border skirmish. The room smelled faintly of pine smoke, medicine herbs and iron. Rain tapped softly against the high windows while wounded wolves rested across nearby cots. Ronan sat several feet away sharpening a long silver blade in complete silence. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone filled the room steadily. Neither spoke for a long time. And strangely, the quiet felt peaceful. Not tense. Not forced. Just quiet. Aurelia realized then how exhausted she had become from constantly managing Kale's moods. Careful wording. Careful timing. Careful silence. Everything around the Moonfang Alpha eventually required emotional calculation. But Ronan? Ronan either spoke honestly or not at all. There was something terrifyingly uncomplicated about that. Finally, Aurelia broke the silence. Why are you helping me? The blade paused briefly in Ronan's hand. He looked up slowly. Not annoyed. Just studying her. Would you rather I didn't? No. Then stop questioning every kindness like you haven't earned one. The response struck something painfully deep inside her. Because people who spend too long unloved eventually begin distrusting gentleness. They search for hidden motives automatically. Conditions. Expectations. Future punishment. But Ronan never behaved as though kindness toward her required repayment. To him, protecting someone mistreated seemed obvious. Normal. That normalcy shattered Aurelia more effectively than cruelty ever had. Her throat tightened unexpectedly. And Ronan noticed immediately. Of course he did. He noticed everything. Not in the controlling way Kale once monitored territory and politics. In the attentive way emotionally present people notice suffering. That difference mattered enormously. And perhaps somewhere deep down, Aurelia already understood the dangerous truth growing beneath all this quiet understanding. Neglected hearts attach quickly to safety, especially after surviving emotional starvation. The realization frightened her enough that she began creating distance instinctively afterward, speaking less, leaving rooms earlier, avoiding prolonged eye contact, not because she disliked Ronan, because she increasingly didn't trust herself around him. Ronan noticed that too. But unlike Kale, he did not force confrontation. He simply gave her space while remaining consistently present, which only made the contrast worse. Far worse. Back in Moonfang Territory, Kale had started unraveling slowly. Witnesses described the changes differently depending on who spoke. Some called him distracted. Others called him volatile. One servant quietly claimed the Alpha had stopped sleeping entirely. What everyone agreed on was this. Kale became obsessed with information regarding Blackwood territory. Patrol reports doubled. Border inspections intensified. Messengers traveled constantly between outposts. Every mention of Aurelia's name reportedly changed the atmosphere inside the council chamber immediately. And then came the incident with the healer's scarf. A minor event politically. Catastrophic emotionally. One of Ronan's wounded warriors had thanked Aurelia publicly during a village gathering by kissing the back of her hand respectfully. Nothing inappropriate. Nothing romantic. But the warrior accidentally returned wearing a scarf Aurelia had lent him earlier during treatment. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Moonfang spies witnessed it. The report reached Kale before midnight. Multiple guards later confirmed hearing furniture thrown violently against stone walls inside the Alpha chambers afterward. Because for the first time since Aurelia left, Kale pictured another man receiving her softness, her care, her gentleness. Things he once treated as permanent. And jealousy behaves strangely in men who only begin valuing affection after losing unrestricted access to it. Especially alpha males. Because beneath the anger, beneath the territorial instinct, beneath the possessiveness, a realization had finally begun forming inside Kael's mind. Ronan Blackwood was not simply protecting Aurelia. He was seeing her. Fully. Carefully. Consistently. And Kael suddenly understood the danger of that far too late. Because once another man teaches a neglected woman what respect feels like, the memory of mistreatment becomes impossible to ignore. The Emergency Council Summit was supposed to prevent war. Instead, it nearly exposed something far more dangerous. Emotion. Representatives from 6 territories gathered inside the neutral mountain stronghold of Velmora 2 weeks after Aurelia entered Blackwood protection. Officially, the meeting concerned disputed trade routes and increasing rogue attacks near the southern borders. Unofficially, everyone came for the same reason: to witness what would happen when Alpha Kale and Alpha Ronan occupied the same room again. Especially now. Especially after the banquet. Especially with Aurelia standing beside Blackwood instead of Moonfang. By the time the council assembled inside the stone chamber, tension had already settled heavily across the fortress. Warriors lined the walls in silence. Servants avoided direct eye contact. Even experienced alphas spoke more carefully than usual, because everyone understood the situation had moved beyond personal conflict. Aluna publicly distancing herself from her alpha was rare enough. Aluna standing beside his greatest rival? That threatened pack stability itself. And then Aurelia entered beside Ronan Blackwood. The entire room noticed immediately. Not because she appeared dramatic. Because she no longer looked like Moonfang's Luna at all. No silver crescent necklace rested against her throat. No Moonfang colors touched her clothing. No mark of Kael's territory remained visible anywhere except the faded bond scar beneath her collarbone. She wore dark northern fabrics now. Blackwood colors. Not as a claim. As protection. That detail mattered politically more than most people realized. The moment Kael saw her standing beside Ronan, the atmosphere inside the chamber changed instantly. Several wolves lowered their heads from pure instinct. The pressure rolling off the Moonfang Alpha became almost suffocating. Violent possessiveness flooded the room hard enough to unsettle even seasoned warriors. Kael's wolf was reacting. Not strategically. Personally. "You're staying in Blackwood territory now?" he asked coldly. His voice remained controlled. Barely. Aurelia met his gaze calmly across the council chamber. "I'm staying somewhere I'm respected." The silence afterward landed like a blade across the room. Several council members visibly stiffened. One Eastern delegate quietly cursed under his breath. Because everyone understood exactly what Aurelia had just implied publicly. Moonfang failed to protect its own Luna. Kael's expression darkened immediately. Before he could answer, Celine touched his arm carefully. An attempt to calm him. A mistake. Because the second her hand reached him, Kael pulled away automatically without even looking at her. His eyes remained fixed entirely on Aurelia. That moment changed something. Not only for Aurelia. For Celine too. Because for the first time she saw the truth clearly. Kael's obsession had never truly been about choosing her over Aurelia. It was about assuming Aurelia would remain regardless. There's a difference between replacing someone and failing to appreciate them until they stop waiting for you. Celine understood that now. And judging by the subtle shift in her expression, the realization unsettled her deeply. Meanwhile, Ronan Blackwood remained seated beside Aurelia with infuriating calm. One arm rested lazily against the carved wooden chair, while the other drummed slowly against the table beside him. Relaxed posture. Sharp eyes. Predatory patience. "Careful, Moonfang," Ronan said smoothly. "You're staring at my guest like you plan to kill someone." The wording mattered. My guest. Not my Luna. Not my woman. Guest. Respecting boundaries while simultaneously provoking Kael beyond reason. Ronan understood psychological warfare exceptionally well. Kael's jaw tightened hard enough to visibly flex. "She is my mate." The statement cracked through the chamber instantly. Not romantic. Possessive. And for several seconds nobody moved. Because alpha mate claims spoken publicly carry weight among wolves. But Ronan answered immediately. "Then perhaps you should have remembered that before humiliating her publicly." Dead silence followed. No one defended Kael. No one challenged Ronan. Because everyone in that room knew the accusation was deserved. The council members suddenly became deeply interested in papers scattered across the table. Several warriors avoided eye contact entirely. Even Celine remained quiet now. And that silence wounded Kale more than direct criticism would have. Because powerful men survive enemies easily. What destroys them is public truth nobody can deny. Kale looked back toward Aurelia slowly then. Really looked at her. Perhaps for the first time in months. And what he saw clearly unsettled him. Absence. No Moonfang necklace. No warmth. No instinctive softness toward him. No emotional reaching through the bond. Just distance. Cold, exhausted distance. People often imagine heartbreak as explosive. But sometimes heartbreak is simply the moment someone stops looking at you with love. Kale saw that absence clearly now. And regret crossed his face so quickly most people missed it. But Aurelia noticed. So did Celine. So did Ronan. That was the dangerous thing about emotional neglect. By the time the neglectful person notices the damage, someone else usually already has. The meeting continued technically. Trade disputes were discussed. Border agreements debated. Military routes reviewed. But nobody truly focused on politics anymore. Because another conflict had completely overtaken the room. Kale barely spoke unless directly addressed. And every single time Aurelia laughed quietly at something Ronan said. His wolf reacted violently. At one point, a glass shattered in Kale's hand without warning. The sound echoed sharply through the chamber. Nobody commented. But everyone noticed. Jealousy among alphas behaves differently than ordinary jealousy. It becomes territorial. Instinctive. Dangerously physical. Especially once another dominant male enters the equation. And Ronan Blackwood knew exactly what he was doing. Not openly. Never openly. But through tiny gestures. Pulling out Aurelia's chair before meetings. Standing slightly closer during tense discussions. Quietly asking whether she had eaten. Small things. Normal things. Things Kale himself used to do years ago. That was the cruelest part. Ronan wasn't outperforming Kale through grand gestures. He was outperforming him through consistency. And the contrast was becoming impossible for everyone to ignore. Especially Aurelia. Because once someone experiences attentive care after prolonged emotional neglect, they begin realizing how little they previously accepted as love. Late that evening, after the council recessed temporarily, Aurelia stepped onto one of Velmora Fortress's upper balconies alone. Snow drifted slowly across the mountains beyond the stone walls. The air felt freezing against her skin. For several minutes she simply stood there breathing quietly. Until a familiar voice behind her said, "You're enjoying this, Kale." Aurelia didn't turn immediately. "Enjoying what?" "This," he snapped. "Watching him provoke me." There was something unstable beneath his anger now. Not rage alone. Fear. Because Kale finally understood what was happening. Not politically. Emotionally. Ronan was becoming important to her. And worse, Aurelia no longer seemed interested in hiding it. She turned toward him slowly. "You know what's strange?" she asked quietly. Kale stared at her in silence. "You only started fighting for me after someone else treated me like I mattered." The word struck him visibly. And for one terrible second, the mighty alpha of Moonfang looked completely lost. By the 6th week after Aurelia left Moonfang, people across the territories began noticing the shift in Alpha Kale. At first, the changes appeared small, easily dismissible. A cancelled hunting celebration here. An abandoned council dinner there. Missed meetings. Long silences during negotiations. But eventually the pattern became impossible to ignore. Moonfang's alpha was unraveling. Not publicly. Not dramatically. Quietly. The most dangerous kind of unraveling. Warriors reported increased aggression during training sessions. Servants whispered about shattered glasses and sleepless nights. Council elders noted Kale had begun revisiting archived reports involving Blackwood territory repeatedly, sometimes until dawn. And perhaps strangest of all, he suddenly started remembering Aurelia again. Not politically. Personally. The tea she preferred during winter. The herbs she mixed into healing salves. The fact thunderstorms made her anxious despite trying to hide it. Tiny details he once overlooked now returned to him with painful clarity. That is the cruel thing about regret. Memory sharpens after loss. People suddenly treasure what they treated carelessly once access disappears. But remembrance is not the same thing as repair. And deep down, Kale sensed that already. Inside Velmora Fortress, Aurelia noticed the changes immediately whenever council sessions forced proximity between them. Kale watched her constantly now. Not subtly. Not strategically. Like a starving man noticing food only after famine begins. If she laughed beside Ronan, Kale's attention sharpened instantly. If another alpha addressed her warmly, his wolf reacted. If she appeared tired, he noticed before anyone else. Months ago, Aurelia would have mistaken that attention for proof of love. Now she understood something far sadder. People often become attentive only after realizing they are replaceable. And that realization rarely comes from growth. Usually it comes from fear. One evening during a heavy snowstorm, Aurelia sat alone inside Velmora's northern library, reviewing healing manuscripts near the fireplace. The library remained nearly empty at that hour. Only the sound of turning pages and distant wind against stone windows filled the room. A peaceful silence. Until she sensed him. Kale. His presence reached her before his voice did. The mate bond still existed physically. Weakened emotionally perhaps. Damaged deeply. But not broken. That was the curse of wolf bonds. Love can die while connection survives. You've changed, Kale said quietly from the doorway. Aurelia did not answer immediately. She closed the book in her lap carefully before lifting her eyes toward him. The Moonfang Alpha looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. Dark circles shadowed beneath his eyes. Tension carved itself permanently into his posture now. For the first time in years, Kale looked less like a powerful alpha. And more like a man losing something he no longer knew how to recover. No, Aurelia whispered. I stopped begging to be loved correctly. The sentence struck him visibly. Not metaphorically. Physically. His breathing shifted sharply. His shoulders tightened. And for one terrible second, real pain crossed his expression before he managed hiding it again. Aurelia watched the reaction calmly. Months ago she might have softened seeing him hurt. But grief changes empathy eventually. Especially when that grief was ignored repeatedly. Kale stepped farther into the library slowly. Snow clung faintly to the shoulders of his dark coat. You think Blackwood loves you? He asked bitterly. Interesting choice of words. Not, do you love him? Not, are you leaving permanently? But love. Because somewhere deep down, Kale already recognized the true danger. Not Ronan's power. Not Ronan's territory. Ronan's attention. I think he sees me, Aurelia replied quietly. Kale flinched. Actual visible pain crossed his face again. And for the first time since the banquet, Aurelia allowed herself to feel satisfaction from it. Not cruelty. Justice. Because now he finally understood what neglect felt like from the other side. You're my mate, Kale whispered again. But the sentence sounded different this time. Not commanding. Desperate. Almost frightened. Aurelia stood slowly from the chair beside the fire. The library suddenly felt very small around them. Very quiet. She walked toward him carefully until only inches separated them. Close enough to hear his heartbeat accelerating unevenly. Close enough to see exhaustion hidden beneath his anger. And softly, almost gently, she said, You only remember I'm your mate now that someone else values me. The truth shattered what little composure Kale still carried. His entire expression cracked open briefly. Because every instinct inside him knew she was right. That was the unbearable part. Not Ronan's interference. Not the public embarrassment. The truth. Kale had loved Aurelia once. Perhaps deeply. But somewhere during ambition, politics, and power, he began assuming her loyalty existed permanently regardless of how carelessly he handled it. And now another man had stepped into the emotional absence he created himself. A man who noticed things. Remembered things. Protected things. Kale lowered his head briefly then, breathing unevenly. Several seconds passed before he finally spoke again. I can fix this. Aurelia's chest tightened painfully at the words. Because once upon a time, hearing that would have meant everything to her. Now it only made her tired. You still don't understand, she whispered. Kale looked up sharply. You think this is about Ronan? Another silence. Long, heavy. Snow drifted steadily beyond the library windows. And somewhere far down the corridor, footsteps echoed faintly before disappearing again. Aurelia held Kale's gaze carefully. This happened long before I ever walked into Blackwood Territory. The words settled between them like a final verdict. As she was right. Ronan did not destroy their marriage. He exposed how empty it had already become. Kale finally seemed to realize that fully. And realization can be devastating once denial disappears. His voice dropped lower afterward. Almost raw. What if I can become that man again? The question carried genuine fear now. Not pride. Not authority. Fear. Because Kale understood something horrifying at last. He was competing against the memory of who he used to be. And losing. Aurelia studied him quietly beneath the warm library firelight. Then very softly she asked the question that truly broke him. Why did it take losing me for you to finally see me? Kale had no answer. Because there wasn't one. Only silence. And in that silence, something inside the mighty alpha of Moonfang finally began collapsing completely. Not his authority. Not his territory. His certainty that Aurelia would always remain waiting for him no matter how deeply he failed her. The announcement shattered the banquet before the musicians even finished the final note. For several seconds after Celine spoke, the hall remained suspended in complete disbelief. Then the whispers began. Fast. Sharp. Relentless. Engaged. To who? When did this happen? Crystal glasses paused halfway to lips. Council members exchanged stunned glances. Even the servants forgot themselves long enough to stare openly across the hall. Because nobody expected this. Not the Eastern delegates. Not the Moonfang Council. And certainly not Kale. Celine Vos stood near the center of the banquet floor in deep silver silk, one elegant hand resting lightly against the arm of Alpha Cashandurl of the Southern Ridge Territory. A powerful alliance. Strategic. Politically brilliant. And utterly devastating to the assumptions everyone had quietly built around her and Kale. Aurelia watched the realization strike Kale in real time. Shock first. Then confusion. Then something far uglier. Not heartbreak. Humiliation. Because for months, the entire territories whispered about Celine, as though she were destined to become Moonfang's next Luna eventually. And now? Celine had chosen someone else entirely. Someone calmer. Safer politically. Someone untouched by scandal. Kale stared at her motionlessly while applause slowly spread through the hall. Too slowly. Too awkwardly. Like nobody knew how they were supposed to react. And in that strange moment, Aurelia suddenly understood everything. Celine had never truly been the problem. She was simply a mirror reflecting something already broken inside Kale. It was never about love. It was admiration. Attention. Validation. Kale thrived on being desired. Needed. Chosen. And Celine had admired him once. Openly. Intensely. Until the violence at the banquet changed the way she saw him too. Aurelia noticed it clearly now in the careful distance Celine maintained beside her new fiancé. The respect remained. The fascination did not. And perhaps that was the true beginning of Kale's collapse. Because losing admiration wounds proud men differently than losing affection. Especially men accustomed to being worshipped. Across the hall, Ronan Blackwood leaned quietly against one of the stone pillars observing everything with unreadable eyes. He did not look surprised. If anything, he looked unsurprised in the way dangerous people often do when everyone else finally catches up to truths they noticed long ago. His gaze shifted briefly toward Aurelia. Not possessive. Not questioning. Simply aware. As though silently asking whether she understood now too. She did. Completely. The banquet continued awkwardly around them, but the atmosphere never recovered. Not after Celine's announcement. Not after Kale's visible reaction. Not after the realization spreading through the room that the feared alpha of Moonfang suddenly looked very, very alone. Because Celine moving on publicly forced everyone to confront an uncomfortable truth. Kale had sacrificed his marriage for something he never truly possessed in the first place. Hours later, long after the banquet dissolved into exhausted conversations and political damage control, Aurelia stepped outside the fortress alone. The night air felt cold beneath the mountains. Moonlight silvered the snow-covered cliffs surrounding Velmora Fortress, turning the entire landscape ghostly and still. For several minutes only wind filled the silence. Then footsteps approached behind her slowly. Measured. Heavy. Kale. Aurelia did not turn immediately. Somehow she already knew this conversation would happen tonight. His voice broke the quiet carefully. I ruined us. The words sounded strange coming from him. Not because they were dramatic. Because they were honest. For the first time in months, perhaps years, Kale sounded completely stripped of pride. Aurelia said nothing. What was left to say? Kale stepped closer cautiously, as though approaching something fragile enough to disappear if handled wrong. Snow crunched softly beneath his boots. I kept thinking there would be time to fix it later. Aurelia closed her eyes briefly. There it was. The real tragedy beneath everything. Not cruelty alone. Delay. Men like Kale always believe love will wait. That apologies can come tomorrow. That affection postponed is affection preserved. Later flowers. Later conversations. Later softness. Later attention. Until one day later arrives too late to matter. Tears gathered visibly in Kale's eyes beneath the moonlight. Not performative tears. Not manipulative ones. Real grief. And somehow that made the moment even sadder. Because Aurelia finally understood something devastating. Kale did love her. He simply loved her lazily. Carelessly. With the arrogance of someone convinced she would remain regardless of neglect. I loved you, he whispered. Aurelia looked at him then. Really looked at him. At the exhaustion hollowing his face. At the regret dragging down his posture. At the mighty alpha finally crushed beneath the weight of his own failures. And softly, almost heartbreakingly softly, she answered, I know. The response destroyed him completely. Because love had never been the issue between them. Not truly. Respect was. Protection was. Effort was. Kale loved Aurelia the way people sometimes love beautiful things they assume belong to them forever. Without urgency. Without fear of loss. Without understanding maintenance matters more than possession. And now he finally understood. Far too late. Kale lifted his hand slowly toward her face. Instinctively. Like he had done years ago when comforting her after nightmares or storms. But halfway there, he stopped. His hand hovered briefly in the cold night air before lowering again. Because somewhere deep down he already knew. He no longer had the right to touch her like that. The realization hollowed him visibly. And Aurelia watched it happen in silence. Not vindicatively. Just sadly. Because this was the cruelest ending possible. Not hatred. Understanding. Kale finally understood the damage fully at the exact moment it became irreversible. Behind them, high above the fortress balcony, another figure stood partially hidden in shadow. Ronan Blackwood. Watching quietly. Not interrupting. Not claiming. Just observing the aftermath of a love story collapsing under the weight of neglect. And perhaps the most tragic part of all was this. If Kale had become this version of himself a year earlier, Aurelia would have forgiven him instantly. But people rarely transform before loss forces them to. And by then, someone else had already taught her what being valued felt like. For years afterward, wolves across the territories would speak about the snowfall at Moonfang Keep. Not because of the ceremony. Not because alliances shifted that morning. Not because Alpha Kale publicly knelt before the woman he once humiliated. But because of what happened after she walked away. Because that was the moment the legend truly began. Snow fell heavily across the ancient stone courtyard, covering banners, rooftops, and armored shoulders in white. Thousands gathered beneath the winter sky. Warriors, council elders, servants, pack families standing shoulder to shoulder behind the outer gates. No one spoke loudly anymore. Moonfang had become quieter these past months. Careful. As though the territory itself sensed its alpha was no longer the same man. Kale stood atop the ceremonial platform dressed entirely in black and silver. Powerful as ever. Broad-shouldered. Crowned by authority. The image of an untouchable alpha. But appearances lie beautifully. And Aurelia knew the truth now. Regret had hollowed him from the inside so thoroughly that sometimes, when he thought nobody watched him, he looked exhausted simply breathing. That was the hidden cruelty of late realization. Once people finally understand the damage they caused, they must continue living with the version of themselves capable of causing it. The ceremony should have focused on trade alliances and territorial restructuring. Instead, every eye remained fixed on Aurelia standing near the lower courtyard steps wrapped in dark northern furs beside Ronan Blackwood. Not touching him. Not clinging to him. Standing beside him by choice. That detail mattered. Kale noticed it too. Perhaps that was why, halfway through the ceremony, he stopped speaking. A strange silence spread across the courtyard immediately. Snow drifted between thousands of watching wolves. Then slowly, Kale stepped down from the alpha platform. A murmur swept through the crowd instantly. Confused. Uneasy. The Moonfang Council exchanged alarmed glances. One elder even rose halfway from his chair before another grabbed his arm sharply. Because powerful alphas do not kneel publicly. Not ever. Yet Kale walked directly across the snow-covered courtyard toward Aurelia anyway. Every footstep echoed through the silence. Ronan watched him approach without moving. Without interfering. His expression remained unreadable. But his eyes never left Kale for a single second. And then, the mighty alpha of Moonfang knelt. Gasps spread through the crowd immediately. Real horror crossed several elder faces. Not because kneeling was weak. Because it was honest. And honesty from powerful men terrifies people more than rage ever does. Kale lowered his head before Aurelia slowly. Not as alpha. Not as leader. Not as the feared wolf who commanded armies. As a man stripped bare by regret. Snow settled across his dark shoulders quietly. I was cruel to the person who loved me most. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to still itself around the courtyard. Aurelia stared at him silently. And for one painful second, memories threatened flooding back too quickly. The old Kale. The younger Kale. The man who once carried her through winter storms and kissed her forehead while she fell asleep beside council fires. The man she loved before power sharpened him into someone harder. But grief teaches dangerous lessons. Especially women forced to survive emotional abandonment alone. Kale's voice broke beneath the snowfall. And if you never forgive me, he swallowed hard. I deserve that. Somewhere in the crowd, a servant quietly began crying. Several warriors lowered their eyes. Even the elders appeared shaken now. Because everyone understood what they were witnessing. Not political theater. Not alpha pride. A man arriving emotionally years too late. The old Aurelia would have forgiven him instantly. Everyone there knew it. The gentle Luna. The healer. The woman who spent years making excuses for wounds she did not deserve. But heartbreak changes people fundamentally. Not loudly. Quietly. Teaches survival. And survival often looks cold to people who never watched you break privately. Slowly, Aurelia crouched before him in the snow. Close enough to see devastation sitting openly behind Kale's eyes now. No anger remained there anymore. Only grief. And hope. Terrible, fragile hope. Then Aurelia reached up softly and touched his face. The entire courtyard seemed to inhale sharply at once. Kale's eyes closed briefly beneath her touch. Relief hit him instantly. Dangerous relief. Because for one devastating moment, he believed this might still end differently. That perhaps love had survived enough to save them. And that was when Aurelia whispered, I loved you enough to destroy myself trying to save this bond. Kale's breathing stopped completely. Snow drifted between them slowly. But I finally loved myself enough to walk away. The mate bond reacted violently. Several nearby wolves physically staggered beneath the emotional force of it. Because bonds do not like endings. Especially unfinished ones. Pain rippled visibly across Kale's face. Not rage. Not pride. Loss. Pure unbearable loss. And perhaps the cruelest part was this. The bond did not break. It remained. Trembling painfully between them like a living reminder of everything they once were. Sometimes surviving hurts worse than severing. Aurelia slowly stood. Kale looked up at her from the snow like a man drowning beneath something he could no longer fight. For a second it seemed he might speak again. Beg again. But no words came. Because finally, he understood. Love cannot survive forever inside neglect. Not even mate bonds. Especially not mate bonds. Aurelia turned away carefully. And the moment she did, Kale's expression collapsed completely. Not publicly. Internally. The realization finally consumed him fully. She was truly leaving. Not emotionally this time. Physically. Permanently. Across the courtyard, Ronan Blackwood stepped forward silently. Not triumphantly. Not possessively. Just present. Steady. Safe. Aurelia walked toward him through falling snow without hesitation. And when Ronan extended his hand, she took it. The gesture itself looked simple. But everyone watching understood the weight behind it. Not ownership. Choice. That was the difference. Ronan glanced briefly toward Kale afterward. No mockery crossed his face. No victory. Only a quiet understanding too heavy for words. Because perhaps more than anyone else there, Ronan understood exactly what it costs to lose something irreplaceable through your own failures. Aurelia never looked back. Not once. And behind her, kneeling in the snow before his entire pack, Alpha Kale of Moonfang finally learned the truth quiet women carry long before they leave physically. They leave emotionally first. Silently. Piece by piece. After enough disappointment. Enough loneliness. Enough nights spent grieving relationships that technically still exist. By the time the physical leaving happens, the real ending already occurred long ago. And as the snow continued falling across Moonfang Keep, the great Alpha finally realized something no amount of power could undo. Some people do not leave because they stopped loving you. They leave because loving you started destroying them.